You've eaten Gotham's wealth, its spirit, but your feast is nearly over.
This is not money. It's an operating table. And I'm the surgeon. Why aren't you laughing?
From this moment on, none of you are safe.
Welcome to the Batman Book Club, a podcast exploring the Dark Knight Library. I am your host, Ryan Lauer. The Batman Book Club is a proud member of the Batman Podcast Network, hosted by Batman on Film. Just go to batmanonfilm.com, click on podcasts, and you'll find the Batman Podcast Network that has a whole list of other Bat-related shows that also like to dive into some other nerdy subjects that we all love to frolic about in our free time. And if you like what's going on with the show and you want to help support the show, just go to patreon.com/Batman VC. Now, thank you for listening to episode 166, Night of the Stalker. Joining me is, I just mentioned Batman on Film. It's the editor-in-chief of Batman on Film, also maybe better known as the Gumbo Guru of Texas, Bill Jet Ramey. Bill, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on, especially with your special guest here.
Oh, absolutely. I would not have this special guest if it wasn't for you. So thanks for coming on. And then obviously thanks for reeling in this special guest. I mean, how can I even, 5-minute introduction, but I mean, he's a comic book writer. He's a comic book enthusiast. He's a film producer, TV producer, but maybe best known as Batman's Batman. Honored to have Mr. Michael Uslan on the show. Michael, thanks for agreeing to come on the Batman Book Club.
Happy to be here. I'm here with one of my friends who, always still, just loves to get somewhere.
Yes.
Wow. My goodness. So is that your travel buddy?
Yeah. What I do is when I have to go into the fast lanes on the highway, I just prop him up in the seat next to me and nobody bothers us.
That's awesome. It looked familiar as the ears were coming up, but then I realized what that was really from. That was some good 89 headgear. Yeah, lovely. I want one. This is your first time on the show. Anybody who's on for the first time, I always have to ask them, even though I could answer this. I mean, it's your answer, but what is your favorite Batman story?
There's no question about it. Absolutely no question about it. Mm-hmm. It's Night of the Stalker from Detective Comics number 439, which was doubly interesting to me because it was during that moment in time when Detective Comics was 100 freaking pages in the DC Super Specs. And you got an array of Golden Age reprints in there, Archie Goodwin's Walt Simonson Manhunter as a backup. It was a great time for Batman. When Archie Goodwin was an editor and you had people like Denny O'Neil and Steve Englehart and Len Wein as some of the primary writers. And of course, you had some of the greatest artists that contributed so much to the return of Batman to his darker roots, to his darkness and integrity, courtesy of Irv Novick and Neal Adams and Jim Aparo in particular.
Listen to those names. Listen to those names.
Such a great time to be a Batman fan. It really was.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I'm looking at the cover here, I'm not seeing about how much were these 100-page issues running for at the time.
50 cents.
50 cents.
Then they went up to a traumatic 60 cents.
Oh my gosh. Breaking banks.
Yeah. That was not pleasant. That was not pleasant at all. But man, did we get bang for our buck back then.
Sure.
We truly did. And you never knew who was going to pop up in an issue, whether it was Mike Golden or Marshall Rogers. It was just a great array of talent with everybody wanting to get their finger on Batman one way or another.
Of course. We all understand that. Like who doesn't, especially these days. Well, that's perfect. I mean, a perfect segue into like what the topic of this episode then is. Let's get to talking about Night of the Stalker. You already mentioned, it was Detective Comics number 439. released in 1974. The credits here are, it's a little different than usually. It's written by an art
And
by
don't
or
believe everything
illustrated.
you read, by the way. Now go on.
Yeah, the I mean, that's why with it being a little different, is that I'm going to read exactly from the page one where it says script by Steve Englehart, plot and pencils by Vin and Sal Amendola, inks by Dick Giordano and editing by Archie Goodwin, from an incident as described by Neal Adams. And I just kind of feel that Professor Uslan's going to give us some insight behind all of those goods.
So I do not want to take anything away from anybody.
Sure.
So I will simply tell you that in my private discussions with Neal Adams about this issue in particular, making sure he understood that this was my favorite Batman story in history, and Neal was very focused and adamant as to the extent of his involvement in this story. And if you look at the artwork, page by page, panel by panel, undeniably, you see Neal Adams all over the place. And he may have indeed suggested this story. And then Steve Englehart did a phenomenal job in the writing of the story. I always felt the writing of this story, it had just enough of poetic essence to it. It was often, when you read the captions, it's often like reading poetry, but it also has just enough of the purple prose of pulp magazines like The Shadow that helps set the scene and drag you back into the world of comic books at the time. The most important element of this whole thing, and when I tell people about this story, it's the one that leaves their eyes popping. This, to me, is the most emotional Batman story I have ever read. And in this story, Batman does not say one word. And that's kind of what makes it so incredible.
You even mentioned with, I just said the scripting was Steve Englehart, and you commented on his writing too, that even on Steve Englehart's website, he's even written about how I think it was addressed to him of the story's not going to have writing. He's like, so of course I had to write dialogue, and all of it except for he wanted the final page, that dialogue he wanted, or not dialogue, but thank you. Yes. That at least like that part stayed in. Before more of those details, I mean, obviously it was released, like I said, in 1974, a physical issue. It's available anywhere digitally. It's been collected in Batman Greatest Stories Ever Told Volume 1, as well as a Tales of the Batman Steve Englehart hardcover that came out a few years ago. That book is available on my favorite app of all time, Hoopla, the digital library, and the issue is available on DC Universe Infinite. So for our discussion, for each of you, let's go to you first, Bill. What version did you read in prep for this?
I read a digital version. I have the physical copy that I bought as a kid. I was 9 years old. This one has the cover on it still, unlike Batman 251, which that cover was gone long ago. But I do have the book. I read that book. But I've got it stored away. I thought I had it loose, but I didn't. It was another one. So instead of me going digging it up, I just read the digital version. At first, I thought it's got to be isn't it in the Detective Comics? The anniversary, the newest one that came out, and it is not. So
okay,
I read the digital. I did not read it in hand, I have to say. So don't take my Batman card away, please.
No, never. I know that for just single issues, especially older ones, single issues, it's always hard to track down exactly what all reprints of things that it showed up in. So recently that I've found are those two collections. How about you, Michael? What version did you read?
The one that came out on the stands in 1974, that Wednesday.
There you go.
Now, I got to ask you, because I didn't look this one up.
Sure.
I'm guessing, this is just a guess now, that the colorist was Tatiana Wood, but I would love to know for sure who colored it, because that also is part of the mix that makes this work so incredibly well in terms of graphic storytelling.
not, let's see. I think it's like DCFandom.com that does a lot of really great stuff, and they do credit. So they list as, oh, it says, okay. So according to them, cover artist Neal Adams, Dick Giordano, Tatiana Wood, and Gaspar Saladino, and then they credit on colorist Jerry Serpe.
Jerry Serpe?
Serpe, there we go. Okay.
Jerry colored the story? That's
Um,
interesting.
According to them, yeah, there you go.
All right. Jerry was an excellent DC colorist. Tatiana was the queen.
Yeah.
She was the one every artist would ask for first.
Mhm.
And she was busy all the time. She was married to Wally Wood for a period of time, and an amazing talented lady. Nice to know she did the cover.
Nice. Yeah.
But Jerry was terrific and a good human being. I'm challenged as to how we talk about this without spoiling it in terms of the last page of the story. So I'm going to have to take my cues from you guys
Okay.
as to if we need to avoid that, or if we can do a spoiler alert and at some point in time discuss that.
I've got two more kind of intro questions, and then we'll just spoil everything about this.
Okay.
I mean, also the story is coming up on 50 years, 39 years, or not 30, 49 years old this year or so. So I mean, we can spoil it like crazy, but for me, I was not able to get my Tales of the Batman Steve Englehart hardcover out of my storage, so I also had to go digital, which is okay, but I love physical. And I entertained myself actually at the comic shop yesterday, and I wondered, maybe let's just see how much this physical guy goes for. And they only wanted $140 for this issue physically, so I didn't pull the plug. I'm just sticking digital, but I'm maybe someday, because Englehart's one of my favorite Batman writers. And then of course I think this is such an iconic cover, with the people that I just mentioned, especially Neal Adams, and the story itself, that I don't know, maybe someday. Do you remember when you first read this story?
Sure.
I think you kind of just answered it.
Yeah. I remember distinctly, like it was yesterday.
The day that it came out.
Yeah.
How about you, Bill?
I was a kid,
You were a kid.
I've told the story. Excuse me. I would go to, when I was a kid, I would go, I was like 9, okay, 8 or 9, depending when it came out, what month. I would go to the corner store, and they had the old spinner racks with comics, and I would, pick some out, and that's where I got this one. And I just kept it around for years. Back in those, I didn't think about, as a single digit bill in age, I didn't think about, backboarding comics and putting them in a bag. I just kept them around and read them and would reread them. So yeah, it's because you're a little bit about my age, but yeah, I was a kid though, but I did read it, when it came out. I don't know how long it had been in there, but probably it was probably 1974. I don't think it was lasting, was it 5 years later and I picked it up, but it's by chance it's been sitting there now. So,
one thing I want to throw out, and it's something you couldn't possibly have been aware of as a little kid. I was a little bit older than that when it came out. I was 23 or just about to turn 23. And so the evolution of Batman back to the dark era was significant and important. And I was working at DC at that time. I was part of the Junior Woodchucks, which was the next generation it was the first time they brought fans into the company to train to become the next generation of professionals at DC.
Wow.
And that was me, Paul Levitz, Bob Rozakis, Jack C. Harris, Anthony Tollin, Carl Gafford, Alan Asherman, Steve Mitchell. I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. But we were the Woodchucks, and we were the kids on the block, the new kids on the block. And so I was there, and this was all happening at a critical behind-the-scenes moment in time when Julie Schwartz, who to me was the greatest DC editor who had ever lived, And just for a little background to some of the listeners, Julie Schwartz is responsible for the Silver Age Flash and Green Lantern and Atom and Hawkman and Justice League. Julie Schwartz is responsible for returning Batman to his darker roots. And at this moment in time, Julie, who had started with the New Look Batman in 1964, Detective Comics 327, and I think it was Batman 161 or 162, Julie had just turned over the reins of Detective Comics to Archie Goodwin. This was a major transition moment. This is a generational transitional moment at DC. And it was at the same era where Neal Adams was reinventing the dynamics of comic book covers and graphic storytelling. And then you had Nick Cardy following his lead, and Jim Aparo and so many other people under Dick Giordano, Denny O'Neil, Joe Orlando, Joe Kubert was taking over the war line from Bob Kanigher. And you had this move editorially from a writer being the editor to an artist being the editor. This was a huge, huge transition time over at DC. And Archie was up to the challenge. And his issues of Detective, which I remember predominantly being the 100-page super specs, but it started before then. And just by having Manhunter as the backup, it just elevated it. It made it pre-graphic novel, graphic novel feeling that as a 23-year-old college or actually law school student, I could read these Batman comics that were being churned out by Denny and Steve and everybody and feel that they were growing up with me. And the graphic storytelling was becoming more and more mature, more and more sophisticated. And it was an incredibly exciting era, especially when a gem like this would show up. And it was the same feeling I had when the Marshall Rogers, Steve Englehart issues began to show up and explore the darkly romantic side of Batman with Silver St. Cloud, the evil of Rupert Thorne, and about gangs in and operating in Gotham City. That was pretty cool, culminating for me in, I think it was a two-parter, The Laughing Fish, which was the Englehart Rogers interpretation of Joker, which was magnificent.
From the later named Strange Apparitions, which is one of my favorite. I mean, I count it all as one story because when I first read those, it was in the Strange Apparitions trade. And so I just count it as one story. It's called Strange Apparitions to me. And I love that run wholeheartedly, which is what made me, Englehart, one of my favorite Batman writers, is because of that era right there. It's a bit of a roundabout way in how I first read this. It was about 2007, in which I think that's around then is when I got the Strange Apparitions trade, but then collection. But then they also released a hardcover called Batman Ego and Other Tales by Darwin Cook. And I was just starting to, I was in college. I started to have money. So I would go to the comic shop and buy anything Batman I could. And I read a story in there called Deja Vu. I'm trying to think exactly. It might have said inspired by or based on a story by Steve Englehart. And I was like, this is interesting. What's this? Because I recognized the name of Englehart because of Strange Apparitions. Let's see. It said based on the 70s classic Night of the Stalker by Steve Englehart, Vin and Sal Amendola, and Dick Giordano. So because in 2007, it wasn't so accessible to get 70s comics. So then I think by way of the internet, I was able to find this Night of the Stalker and realize, like, oh, Deja Vu is an updated version, Darwin Cook's version of Night of the Stalker. And then I was just like wowed by then. So it's one of those things, if I was in my 20s when I finally read it and it was 30 years later, but it's like at least I finally got my hands on something that I was then finding out is deemed such a classic Batman tale, such a classic Batman story. And then that just spread into more 70s stories that I finally got to sink my teeth into and gain such an appreciation for that time period. in Batman comics.
I have to tell you, I always believed in the back of my mind that my second favorite Batman story of all time was part of this thing. And it was Night of the Reaper. So you had Night of the Stalker, Night of the Reaper. That's connective tissue just in the titles alone. But again, in terms of emotional impact and the fact of Batman dealing with Nazis in World War II and the Holocaust, before Marvel's X-Men, or and Magneto got into this whole thing, this was pretty daring, grown-up stuff. This was no longer a DC war comic of Buddha, Buddha, Buddha as you're shooting the Nazis. This had elevated to a whole different plane. And again, I would suggest to anyone, if you're going to read Night of the Stalker, follow it up with Night of the Reaper. It is intense, and it's powerful, and it's an important story.
And if by some chance whoever's listening hasn't read that, I guarantee they know the cover. I guarantee they know that cover for sure. Great cover. Michael, this was all up to you. I put it on you of what you would like to talk about on here. Why did you choose, and this may seem obvious at this point, but why did you choose Night of the Stalker?
All right, so we got to put up the spoiler alerts here.
Spoiler
folks.
alert. All right, there you go.
Seriously, you don't want to listen to what I'm about to say if you have not read it yet. And now let's give them 5 seconds to hang up.
Okay.
All right, here it comes.
We're in.
So, besides the dynamic art and the incredible picturesque, poetic-like storytelling, I mentioned before, in this entire story, which I consider to be the most emotional Batman story ever told, Batman does not say a word. He does not have a word balloon or a thought balloon. Nothing. He's totally silent. His actions and reactions speak volumes. It's deafening. And it culminates. Well, let me go back. It starts with Batman observing a couple and their young son being confronted by gangsters in the streets of Gotham City. Kind of eerily reminiscent of something to Batman. And he is unable to stop what transpires next, which, to his utter horror, is a replay of what happened to him and his parents. And what that unleashes emotionally, what that reawakens inside of Batman Bruce's brain and heart and soul, drives him forward in the most intense manner I have ever seen Batman depicted, as an unstoppable dark force of good, of retribution. And then when this nightmarish scenario finally comes to an end over this long night of the Stalker, he gets back to Wayne Manor and he looks at his parents' portrait and his cowl is down. And I think the final caption is, "And he is that boy once again." And for the first and only time that I know of in 85 years of Batman comics, he breaks down and cries. I mean, it just took it to a whole other level. I always talk about how, I started reading comics when I was little, and Superman was the first superhero I grafted onto because he was friendly. He was on TV every day. I knew Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, and Perry White.
Yeah.
It was all friendly reading, light, bright. And Batman, I had to wait till I was like a much more sophisticated 7 before I really,
you had the world figured out by then.
yeah. And I could figure, oh, okay, this is cool. This is not too scary.
Yeah.
But I started with with that approach. And ultimately, Batman, with this story, became real because it reawakened in me the feelings I had when I first read the origin of Batman comics when I was a kid. Now, at age 8 or 7, whatever I was when I read it, and it was probably in a reprint, I had never once had the thought enter my brain that one day my parents would die, that one day they would not be here. And to read this origin story as a little kid of a kid who's watching his parents murdered in the street in front of him, and him, you know, in the lamplight over their bodies, making this vow, that was gut punching emotion. That's hard to, you never forget it. I mean, it alters your consciousness as a kid, just reading about this happening and then identifying with young Bruce Wayne. So now, all these years later, I'm 23 and I'm reading, and he's breaking down and crying. And just like I related to Bruce when I was 7 or 8, when it happened, I'm now relating to Bruce breaking down into tears over his long gone parents. It was like at that moment, Batman became real to me.
Yeah.
That I knew we were both growing up together and we were on a journey together. And I did not know it would wind up being not only my career, but my entire life in retrospect. But what an amazing journey. And those were flashpoint moments for me with Batman at 2 completely different times in my life.
Wow. I mean, way, like the earlier thing you saw, that was about the non-dialogue. Bill, since Michael and I both experienced this issue for the first time as, I guess as adults in our 20s, can you remember as far back as like when you first read this as a kid, how certain aspects? So first of all, one thing of like, hey, Batman doesn't talk at all in this. Second, kind of what Michael just said too, of like, you're getting your hero that you have put on a pedestal and that you cherish, and then you're seeing the humanity behind him as he removes the cowl and he actually turns and he's crying for that. Can you remember how like multiple things were hitting you as a kid?
It probably not. I don't recall like the first time I read it and how it impacted me. I just remember like reading it and then reading, the prior year reading the Joker's 5-Way Revenge and a lot of the comics that were coming out at that time. It was not the Batman of the 60s TV series, which was my gateway into Batman,
Yeah.
And that it was that period with those comics and Neal Adams and Denny O'Neil and others with the Dark Batman that really formed my sensibilities. That makes sense of what Batman is to me. And so it was like later on, reading as being a little bit older, that the impact of the story and just noticing Batman doesn't say anything in this, and then rereading it for this podcast, I was taken by the dialogue of kind of the narration, right? Where it really points out this, how Batman is a dark creature. He is the dread, the strange night dark nemesis of evil, creature of hell. Descriptions like that. It just stood out to me again of how, especially when you take in context of the period it came out in 1974, it wasn't that long ago that Batman in the comics was a lot different, 5-6 years before that, before 1969 rolled around, and they sent Robin off to college, right? And he moved, shut down the Batcave and all that. So Yeah, I mean, it just impacted me because it's those stories, and this is one. It's one of my favorites, along with Joker's 5-Hour Revenge. Formed my Batman. What's Batman to me in my head and my heart, if that makes any sense.
You know,
It
I
does.
actually remember having discussions at the comic book shop in Bloomington, Indiana,
Woo!
where I got this. And it was a Wednesday, and a number of the fans were there. And I it was incredible to me that when we went back the next week after it had been out, and I saw a lot of these people, and we started to talk about it, probably, I want to say maybe half of them did not catch, were not even aware that Batman had no dialogue at all in the story. They had to like go back and look at that. It didn't
Yeah,
hit them that that was the case. That's pretty amazing too.
for sure.
What I'd like to know, Michael, can I ask Michael a question, Brian? You don't care, right?
Fine,
Yes,
that's
you do.
fine. Okay, yeah.
Okay. There's a lot of times when like the people who say, oh, Batman, Batmania for Batman 89 wasn't that big of a deal. And I'm like, you weren't there. You weren't around. If you weren't around, you don't understand. You don't. What comics like this, was there a big, like saying you went to the comic book shop, was there like a big uh, uh, what was the reaction, by people who had read it and you go in and discuss it? Was it like a big
Was there a
deal, this
buzz?
story? Yeah. Buzz?
Uh,
Because it
I
was a
wouldn't call
different
it a
time,
big,
right?
I wouldn't call it a big buzz. Um, there was so much going on at that time in comics, of both Marvel, DC, and other places. It was all in a transformative state. So Batman was not yet the focal point. It became beginning in 1989. Everything changed. Back then, we had Batman appeared every month in Detective Comics, Batman Comics, World's Finest with Superman, Brave and Bold Team Up, and here and there, Justice League. That was it. I think the last time I looked, a couple of months ago, there were 31 Batman related titles out in a month. So this was a very, very different time. There were more Superman titles than there were Batman titles. And but everything was changing. Everything was changing. So, but you mentioned Batman 89, and I have to bring this up. This story has been around. You've heard me tell it numerous times. It's in my book. Our lives changed in terms of trying to bring Batman to the silver screen in 1986 when Tim Burton came aboard. And I got a call from the studio exec over there at the time. And they said, we got this kid and he's at a Disney animation. He's just done this amazing movie for us. We want you to see it. We'll screen the fine cut of Pee-wee's Big Adventure for you.
Wow.
So I went over to the studio, watched Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and they said, let us know what you think. And I said, my God, I have never seen such a creative combination of direction and art direction in my life. I would love to meet this guy. So the studio set up 3 lunches between me and Tim. My job in the first lunch was, number 1, to indoctrinate him into the world of Batman, which I didn't know how much he had already, knew. I was guessing, well, coming out of Disney animation, he must be totally into comic books. And I was blown away that he wasn't, and that he really wasn't familiar with Batman, with much Batman. So job number 1, indoctrinate him into that world. And job number 2, equally, if not more important, keep him away from all the silly crap. So I was the filter and made sure that he never saw the Super Batman of Planet X, Bat Genie, Robot Batman, Rainbow Batman, Batman this, Batman that. That might. What I gave him as source material from my collection were reprints of Detective Comics 27 through 38, which covered Batman's solo career to the introduction of Robin. I gave him Batman #1, which introduces Joker and Catwoman. I gave him the Denny O'Neil, Irv Novick, Neal Adams issues of Batman Detective Comics, mostly Detective Comics, that was out at that time. And I gave him the Steve Englehart, Marshall Rogers run with Silver St. Cloud. And then I gave him Night of the Stalker. That was the bundle that I used to indoctrinate Tim into the world of Batman. By the time our third lunch was done, I was absolutely sure this was the guy. And I could go on and on about what he did. He is the one individually responsible for what I always call the big idea that would change Batman, change the comic book industry, change the movie industry, change Hollywood forever, and open up the door to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And that was simply, and I don't want to get too off track here, so I'm just going to mention it without going into detail, was simply when he said, if we are going to make the first revolutionary, dark and serious comic book superhero movie ever, this movie cannot be about Batman. This movie must be about Bruce Wayne. And that has changed everything. And I don't know how many times I talked to Stan Lee about this. Stan said, absolutely, that's what opened the door. That's why Iron Man movies should really be called Tony Stark. And that's why Spider-Man movies should really be called Peter Parker. It all goes back to Tim's big idea. So did his reading of this initial material have an impact? In my humble opinion,
yeah,
of course it did. Look at the opening of Batman 1989. It's Night of the Stalker.
yes,
Yeah.
So you want to talk about an impact that an individual comic story can have, which is why you should go rush out right now and grab that damn issue for $140 and put it away somewhere.
All right, stand by. I'm going.
It was instrumental in Batman 89.
You know, I've read your books. I talked to you even about Batman's Batman. But I don't remember specifics on the Night of the Stalker part, and you connecting that. I don't know why, like an aha moment now of, yeah, I mean, I just went back even further. Oh yeah, 89, the opening of that as a kid, I did think that's, oh my gosh, this is the Wayne murders. And then, oh no, it's not. I never thought of like putting it together of like, oh yeah, this is just like Night of the Stalker, the Batman, he's seeing this happen. And it's, oh my God, ta-da.
Ding, 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 ding,
Yeah,
ding.
I'm late to the game, but at least I showed up.
Now, I'll give you one other comic book that you
Please
might want to get your hands on, something I wrote. It was for Dynamite. It's the Shadow #100. And Nikki Barucci at Dynamite asked me if I would do a special story for that issue. And in that story, the Shadow confronts Orson Welles and gives him a piece of his mind in terms of what he is doing on the radio. But there's also an incident that the Shadow witnesses of a young boy and his parents being accosted in an alleyway. And all of a sudden, without naming names, if you go back and read Shadow #100 story that I did, it will augment anytime you read the story of Bruce Wayne and his parents.
Huh. Crazy. How about that? How about them apples? Bill, something that you asked when you were asking Michael about like the buzz, and Michael, you said that it seemed that some people didn't believe that Batman didn't have any dialogue. I think that adds to the fact that I think this issue, and there's just something about that era of comics, I think for sure, of they have such like value in revisiting, because I think initially in reading it, because Batman's not talking, you do kind of go through it fast, and it is very much, I think the pacing is very fast of like, oh my gosh, Batman's going after these guys and all that. But then you go back and it's like, if you take your time, take a breath, and really just kind of settle into the atmosphere of it all, and then now really start to drink in the art, and then you do pick up on Batman doesn't talk, but him becoming this creature of the night, and how that is drawn so well and inked well and colored well of these shots even. And like my favorite one of it, and it's Darwin Cook's version has one of my favorite Batman panels ever, and it's mocked from this of when Batman's crouched on those rocks after the criminals get out of the car and look at him. He's crouched on the rocks. Darwin Cook did it where they did that, but he's on a tree. And I think the coloring of it is just awesome. It's a purple background and everything. But you have Batman when he's shaking the keys and drops some, and then he's mostly in silhouette, a little bit of blue, but then you can't see a face. And and the symbols in black and stuff. And I'm like, just drinking in that art alone is like, oh my gosh, that's Batman. There doesn't need to be dialogue at all, because you get the point just going panel to panel and just seeing, even whether he's doing something like the water fight.
Now you hit it.
There we go.
That's my favorite panel. Neal's drawing of Batman underwater, pulling the guy face to face underwater. That was aside from the last panel, that was my favorite panel of the whole piece. I also love the one that had his whole bat cape unfolded, where you saw him as if almost he was in flight in that one panel.
I mean, I know I usually hit all these up towards the end, but I just said mine. Michael just said his. Bill, what's your favorite panel of the issue?
He just took it from me. I posted it on Twitter or X, just that picture. It's Batman pulling the guy down in the water. And like, just before that, he is like, I did it, I got rid of Batman basically. And it's just
hands
Batman.
Up.
Yeah. I love it.
And oh, go ahead, Michael.
There's another panel. Don't ask me which Batman issue it's from. I don't remember. But it was, again, one of my favorite of all time is a Neal Adams looming figure of Batman after the guy's been talking his mouth off, and turn around and Batman goes, boo.
Oh, yes. Oh, my gosh. I can see it. I can't remember.
I can't remember what it's from, but that is one of my all-time favorite Batman panels as well.
Wow. Yeah. And I mean, it strengthens the water issue underwater, which granted he's underwater, but in seeing those panels, just like anybody challenge me of a word balloon that needs to be there and a word that Batman needs to say. It's like, it's justified that there's nothing. It says everything you need to hear and more by saying nothing. Just the images itself. I mean, great. Just great. Yeah. And I mean, especially with when you get after the murder and you get, just the tone of when Batman's having the flashback of the Wayne murders, the coloring of that and the tone of it all. And I mean, even the nod of as Joe Chill's running away and Little Bruce is standing there with his hands up, but you look at the shadow and what it creates on the wall, I don't think it's forced. I think it is subtle because, I don't remember reading this until this time as I'm drinking everything in. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's Batman in his shadow and stuff too. I just think like the art beginning to end of it, it's just so good. So by something being so good, of course you could probably say, well, then Neal Adams probably did it. But I know there are other credits on here as well. Do you have what I want to say? Is there more context behind the art that either of you know that you can share aside from just like who's on the credit on the first page?
Oh, that's Mr. U question right there.
Okay.
Yeah, again, I am cautious because I don't want to take anything away from Sal, or Dick and the inking that he did. I can only go by looking in Neal's face
from the man himself.
and Neal being very adamant about the extent to which he is pervasive in this particular story. So I honor him by passing that along, but not making a comment as to who specifically drew what or inspired what or laid out what. I will leave that to history.
I was in looking some things up for this issue specifically and, typing in Night of the Stalker and Neal Adams just to see if there was some context, because that did get me from an incident described by Neal Adams. And as we know, with all sorts of terminology when it comes to credits, of every single word counts. And so that's very carefully worded. And I did come across, I think it was on the comic book resources, where they a writer had talked to Sal Amendola, in which he referenced, and this is as much as I can remember, is pretty broad, about Neal Adams shared this idea of a water fight, of in which now we just kind of referenced it, of Batman pulling the guy under and everything. But that was, I couldn't find anything more in depth than that to go on, so that it's like, oh yeah, this source says this and this one says this. So it's still, I mean, I'm always a student. I tell Bill this all the time. I'm always a student. I'm always learning. I don't know it all. That's as much context as I could find on it that has been written. And so exactly.
You won't. And I'll give you one other unrelated story, but kind of adds up to the same thing. I was close with Will Eisner. Spent a lot of time with Will. And we were at a Comic-Con. Don't ask me if it was San Diego or New York. We were sitting together. And it was a panel with some of the old time artists on it. Now, back in the 70s, I did a book for Simon & Schuster Fireside called America at War, the best of DC war comics. And in that, I reprinted the very first Black Hawk story from Military Comics #1. And to prepare for it, I did a lot of work. I talked to so many old timers to try to get a sense of who created Black Hawk, or who was involved in the creative process of Black Hawk. And there were numerous people. There was Will, there was Chuck Quidera, there was Bill Woolfolk, and others. But it was always clear from both the artwork, analyzing the artwork itself, and from my discussions with Will had created Black Hawk. And then Chuck and Bill Woolfolk and others, Bob Powell, ultimately, they got involved and early, right from the beginning. And we were at this panel, and Chuck Quidera was up there. And he was, it was quite a loud rant about that he had solely created Black Hawk, and other people, i.e. Will Eisner, were should not be credited for it. This was mine. That's why I named Chuck. And I'm sitting there listening to this rant, and I'm with Will. I said, Will, I've researched this for this book. I talked to so many people. This just is not the way it was. I said, you created Black Hawk. I said, if you're not going to stand up and say something now, I will. And he said to me, don't. He goes, I've accomplished a lot of things in my life. I've done a lot of things in my life. This is his one thing. Let him have it. And that was Will's reaction to it. It's like, I don't need you to set the historic record straight. Let him have his moment. Let him have it. And I think that that's probably a little bit of what Neal and other people, might feel in the same set of circumstances. So again, taking nothing away from Sal, nothing away from Steve at all, or Dick, or anybody. This is a good place. Look for yourself. Look at it yourself and see what you believe is an influence that can be seen with your two eyes of Neal Adams, whether in a pose, in a concept, in a drawing, and everybody can decide for themselves.
An interesting mind to pick on this. I guess I could say all three of our mutual friend, Peter Vera, who, Michael, he's been in your house to interview you for Batman on Film, even. Like he lives and breathes for Neal Adams. And I actually talked to him on the phone last night, even, and we were talking about Neal Adams. And there's somebody to pick our brain, or to pick his brain, Bill. Pete, what do you think? You were close with Neal Adams. There you go. What do you think? Let me go ahead and ask you then, I mean, each of you, of like, what's your favorite part of the issue? Go ahead, Bill. We'll go with you first.
Well, okay. I think it's the jiggling of the keys.
The keys?
Yeah.
Nice.
It's just it's very Batman. They couldn't find him. Didn't know where he was, and then he's just right there, and he's taking their taking the keys away from him, and it's all it's like almost like come and get it. That's what came to mind my first. You would
Come
think
and
it
get
would
it.
be the ending, but it was that really stood out to me.
Sure. How about you, Michael?
It's the dichotomy in this virtually short story of Batman, the Batman, as a relentless force of nature, relentless, driven, almost feels supernatural in terms of he can't be stopped. He can't be stopped. He's coming. He's coming. He's coming. He's coming. And you've got this Batman, pure Batman, inspired by the Shadow. The Shadow had a lot of the same feeling as almost a force of nature to him. And then it ends with the emotional Bruce Wayne and the humanity of it. So it's force, breakdown. That juxtaposition is incredible. That's what makes the last page pay off so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's stories like this that I'm sorry, Brian.
No, go for it.
Yeah, I just gonna say it every time I read these issues from the 70s, it makes me long for the days where you could just go pick up a single issue and read a Batman story that has a beginning, middle, and end, and you don't have to read, for months and months and months, crossovers and whatnot. I wish there was more of that in comics.
I mean, I so totally agree with you. Think of Denny O'Neil's Crime Alley story. Another impactful, emotional story told and done in one. Demon of Gothos Manor. When I was a little kid, Robin Dies at Dawn. It was a 3-part story that as an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old was tremendously emotional for me. Night of the Reaper we mentioned, but here's another one. Let's jump out of the box for a second and go over to Murray Boltinoff over at Brave and Bold. Read individually the first 3 Batman Deadman team-ups by Bob Haney and Jim Aparo. Man, that's incredible Batman storytelling. And it's outside the normal realm. People don't, normally go back there and reconnect with what's going on. But these were all individual stories with different editors who believe they had different age group audiences. Yet you could still read these individually and you could still, as a Batman fan, say, wow. And that's without having to accept continuity every single second.
Yeah.
It wows me as you're listing. And I know that you provided a list on Batman on Film before too, like of covers and stories. But even as you mentioned the stories and like instantly Robin Dies at Dawn, it's like I don't remember specifics of the issue, but you bet I know that cover. It's same thing. Night of the Stalker, you bet I know that cover. And just as you fire off some of these issues and the covers.
Oh my God, the Robin Dies at Dawn cover inspired Crisis on Infinite Earths. And if you start to go from the Supergirl cover, and how many homages and copies of that have gone forward from Marvel to DC to Independence to graphic novels, it's, oh my God, what that started. It is so freaking iconic.
Only Batman, right?
Yeah.
Only Batman. I guess I need to go around and answer my own question. I think my favorite part is definitely when the car chase. From the moment that the criminals, they see Batman's silhouette, or they see his shadow on the rocks up through the keys, because that's such a great, you need a great example of Batman. Just look at those 3 pages and it goes way back to criminals are a superstitious and cowardly lot. It enforces that. It enforces Batman's a creature of the night. They all shoot at him and he's just gone. But then they turn around, there he is with their keys. It's like, wait, how did he make that loop all the way around? Because he's Batman. That's why. And then the art on top, like all of that. I just love like every piece of 3 pages and every piece. And I'm like, yeah, there's Batman. Like perfection. Batman perfected right there. Now this is where put your, I guess you can answer this, Michael, with a producer's hat on or your fan cap on. Your choice. I always like to ask when we cover whatever story, if it hasn't been done yet, would you like to see this story adapted in animation?
Oh, of course.
Of course. Okay.
Of course. And, I leave it up to the brilliant people who mastermind the animation. But this and Night of the Reaper, I think, certainly deserve attention. And as I always felt there was connective tissue there. It would be great if one day that came to pass.
How about you, Bill?
Oh, you know me. I think you could take the premise of Joker's Five-Way Revenge and turn it into an animated film, not even just a short.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, certainly I'd like to see some of these classic 70s stories get some modern day due, if you will, through animation, because there's a lot of good stuff there,
Endless amounts.
Stuff. So yeah.
As I think a lot of us, I'm just sitting here speaking from a fan's perspective because I don't know anything of. I eagerly await this Caped Crusader series to just kind of see what's the vibe and tone of that show. How's that going to look? And I know we have one still that was released a couple years ago, and that in that design is like, well, that in its own, I'm kind of like, I wonder if that they'll use Night of the Stalker in some way. Like that would be great. So I'm like a very, very emphatic yes of, yeah, give it to me. I'll take it. Sure. Why not? Because as I learned today, sitting here, you kind of got a version of that, the opening of Batman 89. So I guess extend it, but put a little twist on it somehow to make it different. And animation, yeah, sure. Why not? Give it to me.
Can I say one
it.
thing, Ryan? A couple things that Mr. Yu said, Batman being relentless, and then talking about, the opening scene 89. There was almost, as I was thinking as we were talking about it, there's that in the Batman with the Penguin car chase when Batman's chasing him.
Yeah.
And, at the end, Batman just slowly walks to the car with the flames behind him, and the sheer terror on the Penguin's face, seeing him. And yes, exactly. And it just reminded me of that. I just wanted to mention it. I don't know if there's any connection between the two, but it's just some of the great things about Batman you can see in different mediums and different periods of time.
Absolutely agree with you. And in that movie in particular, you had that sequence, you had the opening sequence with Batman where he slowly comes out of the shadows, and you hear the footsteps and you see the boots, and then relentless. And then, it kind of echoes the end result here in Night of the Stalker with the one person who just collapses and says, please don't hurt me, blah, blah, blah. There's some parallels you can draw here.
Yeah, absolutely. As I guess as an inch to wrap up, I want to give the floor to both of you on like a final thought on the issue, something you haven't said, if you want to summarize thoughts, feelings, anything at all. Final words on Night of the Stalker.
You go, Bill.
Thanks for inviting me on. I know this was you usually do these one-on-one, but yes, I'm glad this story was picked. I got to revisit it, and then after listening to a lot of just the discussion and reminders, like that's the opening to Batman 89, things like that, just make me even appreciate it even more. So,
which I'm slightly embarrassed. I never thought of it until now, but whatever. I'll admit it.
You learn something.
Yeah,
I've learned this throughout the years. You learn something new every time you visit with Mr. Yu. And you can always, I've considered myself a teacher, because I was one, and I'm a lifelong learner. So I love learning about anything Batman and Batman history. So yeah, it's fun.
How about you? Any final thoughts, Mr. Uslan?
Yeah. I would love to hear from your viewers, listeners, who now will go back and find it digitally or hard copy and read it. I would love to hear reactions from people in 2023, Batman readers, Batman fans, as to their perspective on what they get out of the story. I wonder if Batman 89, The Batman, have in any way, shape, or form diluted the impact of the comic book story. If the audiences have become a little jaded, and it's just not as impactful as it was for me in 74, or if even all of these decades later, this story where Batman does not utter a word and then breaks down at the end, if that still has an emotional impact on Batman fans today.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I hope I get some feedback on it, because I want to know too. New readers, I don't know, admit it, it's fine if you've never read it and you're going to read it now. Yeah, because that's a great fresh perspective that I'd love to hear. How does this resonate now to new readers, compared to people who've been reading comics for decades and stuff? That'd be great. I mean, as with Batman, like it's always hard to ask somebody a favorites, because how can you, like, there's never, with Batman, there's too much good stuff to just be like absolute, there's one absolute favorite and it's this. So I think this story and revisiting it is grouped into that, like, defining Batman stories. The word that I'm going to take away from this conversation is relentless. A great example of a relentless Batman, Night of the Stalker. No dialogue, just presence. Great example of that. And then a great example at the end, as you've seen this creature of the night in this force, you humanize him and realize Bruce Wayne at the very end too, which is such a great capper to the story. And it's a good gut punch too. And sometimes, gut punches are okay. In this case, that's the only example of where a gut punch is good, is when a story really hits you. So I don't think both of you, I mean, Michael, it was a treat, a real pleasure and honor that you came on here to talk some Batman comics. I'd said to Bill, I was like, sign me up. I love hearing Michael Uslan film stories, producer stories, Indiana University stories, right here in the Hoosier State. And I said, do you think he'd be interested to come on and just a Batman comic fan? And we want to talk a little bit about some Batman comics. And so, Bill, a big thank you that you hooked us up to make that happen. So if there's anything you want to plug where people can follow you on your great postings on Instagram and stuff, plug away, Michael.
Yeah, sure. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook. My kids have been pestering the hell out of me to get on some of these other things. I'm just not doing it. This is the snarky curmudgeon part of me. But I do have a regular presence on Instagram and Facebook, and I think you guys will agree, a lot of the stuff I post is just a lot of fun.
Yes.
Especially if you're a Batman comic book, movie, or animation fan. You'll see some stuff there that hopefully will always bring a smile to your face. And I have very, very hard and fast rules about civility and respecting other people's opinions as to which Batman is their favorite. We all have our own personal favorite, one true Batmans that resonate with us, and we need to respect what everyone else's one true Batman might be. My 2 memoirs are out now, both in Audible books and on print and digital. And it is The Boy Who Loved Batman and Batman's Batman through Amazon or barnesandnoble.com. And the last thing I'll mention is, and hopefully I'll have a lot more to say about this first of the year, the Nederlander organization of New York City is turning my memoir, The Boy Who Loved Batman, into a Broadway play. Awesome. And it is being fast-tracked, and lots of good things are happening. I could not be more excited about it. It's the story of my 10-year odyssey, buying the rights to Batman when I was a kid in my 20s, and the 10 years it took us before we were able to get the first movie made in 1989. So hopefully it'll be an entertaining and fun story that I hope will inspire a lot of people. And if there's any lesson, it's follow your passion, get up off the frickin' couch and be proactive about it, learn how to deal with frustration and make a commitment and persevere, hang on by your fingertips and persevere. And ultimately, that's what the story is about. So I'm hoping at this stage of my life and career that this will be part of a legacy for me as to why the whole Batman franchise is important on a whole different level.
Awesome. Excellent. Bill, follow that up.
I can't.
You can't.
Batman on film.
There you go.
My little small,
Yeah.
portion of Batman history and Batman on film history. Batman-on-film.com. 25 years.
Yeah.
This year
Wow.
I've done that, and
Quarter century.
still got
I love
Batman
it.
films
I
coming.
rely on it, Bill. It's great
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
absolutely. As for the Batman Book Club, follow on Twitter and Instagram at the Batman BC. Also on Batman on Film, Bill posts these episodes generously on Batman on Film, so you can find it there as well. And I mean, if you want to help support the show and you don't want to spend any money at all, it's 100% A-OK. The easiest, quickest, and most impactful thing you can do is leave a rate and review on any podcast provider that you use. The more reviews the show gets, the more it helps spread the word. And I mean, as we all know, as Ra's al Ghul said in Batman Begins, the word is panic. So for Michael Uslan and Bill Jet Ramey, I am Ryan Lauer. And until next time, read more Batman comics.